I stood alone in the parking lot of my own factory at 11 o'clock at night, and I watched the security lights click off one by one along the loading dock, the way they always did, on a timer nobody had bothered to reset since the plant expanded in 2009. I had walked out of that building thousands of times. I had never once stood in this particular spot afterward, keys in my hand, unable to make myself cross the last 30 feet to my truck. 3 contracts. That was the number sitting in my chest like a swallowed stone. 3 of the largest accounts Edwards Furniture Manufacturing had carried in a decade, gone inside of 90 days. Each one slipping away with an explanation just reasonable enough to accept, and just strange enough to keep me awake. A change in the client's budget cycle. A delay they blamed on our lead times, though our lead times had not changed since spring. A phone call that ended before I had finished making my case, as if the man on the other end had already decided the conversation before he dialed. I had built nothing of this company. That was the truth I kept coming back to, standing there in the cooling night air with the smell of sawdust and machine oil still on my shirt. My grandfather had built it with a single lathe and a bank loan he was terrified of. My father had taken it from a regional outfit to a name that mattered across 3 states. What I had done for 30 years was try not to be the generation that lost it. I had succeeded, more or less, right up until the spring of this year, when something in the foundation of my own business began to shift in a way I could not yet name. A man who has run a manufacturing company for 3 decades learns to trust a particular kind of instinct. You walk a shop floor enough times, and you develop a feel for when a machine is about to fail before the gauges tell you. You hear a bearing start to complain 2 days before it seizes. It is not magic. It is pattern recognition built from 10,000 small observations you never consciously cataloged. That instinct had been humming under my ribs for weeks, low and constant, the way a machine hums when something inside it has come slightly out of alignment and has not yet announced itself as a breakdown. I told myself it was market conditions. I told myself competitors get aggressive, that High Point had always been a town where furniture companies circled each other the way sharks circle a boat testing for weakness. I had said this to my father exactly 9 days earlier, standing in his small office at the back of the plant, the one he still kept, though he had signed the company over to me 11 years before. He had listened to my explanation with the particular stillness he reserved for things he did not believe, and he had said only one sentence in return. Logan, in 60 years, I have never seen 3 good clients leave a well-run shop for reasons that reasonable. I had not known what to do with that sentence, so I had done what I always did with things I could not yet process. I had gone back to work. My father was 89 years old. He no longer came to the plant every day, and when the board had eased him out of daily operations 11 years earlier, he had accepted it with a grace I had not entirely expected from a man who had spent 60 years treating this company the way other men treat a limb. But he still kept that back office, and he still asked for the weekly operations report. The dry stack of numbers most people in my position would have stopped reading closely a decade ago. I had assumed for years that he read it out of habit, the way a retired ball player still watches box scores. I was beginning to understand that my father did not do anything out of mere habit. He read every line of that report the way he used to walk a shop floor, waiting for the one number that did not belong. He had not told me what he saw in it. Not yet. He had only asked in that flat, unhurried voice he used when he already knew the answer to his own question, whether I had looked closely at who exactly had been in the room every time one of those 3 contracts came apart. I had not wanted to answer that question. I still remember standing in his office with the late afternoon light coming through the blinds in long yellow bars across his desk, feeling something cold settle low in my stomach. The particular cold of a man who suspects he already knows a truth he has not yet allowed himself to look at directly. My phone was still in my hand when it rang, the screen lighting up the dark cab of my truck before I had even opened the door. And for a moment, I simply stood there in the gravel and looked at the name on the display. Because at 11 o'clock at night, a call from that particular number meant only one thing. It meant that whatever had been quietly rotting inside the walls of my company for the better part of a year had just reached the point where it could no longer stay hidden. I answered it. I said the only thing there was to say. Go ahead. And the voice on the other end told me something that would not fully make sense to me for another 3 weeks, though I would spend every one of those weeks turning the words over like a board I was checking for warp, looking for the place where the grain had gone wrong. My name is Logan Edwards. I am 61 years old. For 30 years I have run the company my grandfather built with his own hands, and I want to tell you how I nearly lost it, not to a competitor, not to a bad economy, but to two people I let stand close enough to see exactly where the joints of my life were weakest. This did not start with cruelty. It started the way these things always do, with someone deciding that what they already had was no longer enough. To understand what that phone call meant, you have to go back further than that parking lot, back past the 3 lost contracts, back to a Tuesday morning in 1968. When my grandfather, a Korean War veteran with 2 good hands and no capital to speak of, walked into a bank in High Point, North Carolina, and asked for a loan against a single wood lathe he did not yet own. High Point was already furniture country by then, had been since the railroads came through in the 1880s, and my grandfather wanted a small piece of it. The banker who approved that loan, according to family legend, did it mostly because he admired the steadiness of my grandfather's hands, rather than any confidence in the business plan. He built Edwards Furniture Manufacturing, 1-bedroom suite at a time. My father took over in 1983 and did the thing every second generation either does or fails to do, which is grow the thing without losing what made it worth having. By the time I inherited the company 11 years ago, we were shipping case goods and upholstered furniture to retailers across 3 states, employing 210 people, and carrying a reputation my grandfather would not have recognized, and my father had spent 40 years earning. I want you to understand that I did not think of the company as mine. Not really. Not even after 11 years as chairman. I thought of myself as the current custodian of something that had been built by better men than me. And my job was simply not to be the generation that let it fall apart. I met Jennifer at a furniture market in 1996, back when I was 33 years old, and still learning the difference between a good deal and a deal that only looked good under showroom lighting. She was working the floor for a fabric supplier out of Charlotte, 26 years old, sharp, featured with a way of holding a room's attention without seeming to try for it. I remember the specific green of the dress she was wearing, the way she laughed at something one of my colleagues said, with her head tilted back just enough to be noticed, and the way her eyes moved past him to me for exactly 1 second longer than politeness required. I was not an especially confident man in those years. I had spent my 20s inside a factory learning joinery and finish work and inventory systems, instead of learning how to talk to women in rooms like that one. Jennifer made it easy. She had a gift for making a man feel like the only interesting person in a crowded space, and I did not yet understand that this particular gift, in the wrong hands, is not a form of warmth. It is a form of leverage. We married 2 years later. She came into the company not long after, as a junior accounts coordinator, and over the following 2 decades, she rose fairly, and by her own considerable competence, to Vice President of Operations, the second most powerful office in the building after mine. I want to be honest about this part, because it matters to everything that came after. Jennifer was good at her job. She understood logistics the way I understood wood grain, instinctively, at a level below conscious thought. For most of our marriage, I believed we had built something together in the truest sense. Not just a household, but a working partnership, the kind my parents had modeled for me, without either of them ever using that word for it. She stood at the head of the long conference table on the third floor the Monday after I lost that third contract, delivering the quarterly logistics report to the senior staff with the same crisp authority she always brought to that room. And I remember watching her from my seat at the far end and thinking, not for the first time, that she was still the most composed person in any meeting she attended. Her hair was silver now at the temples, in a way she refused to color, which she said she had earned, and there was something almost architectural about the way she carried herself. Spine straight, chin level. The posture of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she would never again be the girl working a fabric booth for other people's commissions. When the subject of the lost contract came up, she delivered the explanation smoothly. The client's internal budget restructuring, a timeline issue on our end that predated her involvement. And the room nodded along the way. Rooms do when the person speaking has earned the benefit of the doubt many times over. I nodded too, but I noticed, in the half-second before she began speaking, that her eyes had moved briefly toward the window rather than toward me. The way a person's eyes move when they are choosing their next sentence, with more care than the moment on its surface required. I did not think much of it at the time. I want to be honest about that too. A man does not spend 30 years building trust with his wife, only to read betrayal into a half-second of eye contact. I filed it away the way I filed away 100 small observations a week in that building, and I went back to my office, and I did not think about it again until 3 days later, when Elijah Diaz walked into the conference room for the first time. And I watched something shift very slightly in the muscles around Jennifer's mouth. A movement so brief I would have missed it if I had not spent 30 years learning to read the smallest tells in a piece of wood before I put a blade to it. There is a particular kind of composure that looks from the outside indistinguishable from contentment. It took me most of our marriage to understand that Jennifer had mastered the first without ever quite arriving at the second, and that the gap between those two things was where everything else eventually grew. She was 54 years old that autumn, and she had aged the way certain women do who have spent their whole lives being looked at and have learned to use it. Every year, adding a kind of precision rather than softening anything. She kept her hair colored everywhere except the silver at her temples, which she left deliberately, because a stylist in Charlotte had once told her it read as confidence rather than age, and Jennifer had taken that observation and built an entire visual language around it. She dressed the way she ran meetings. Nothing wasted, nothing accidental. I had watched her walk into rooms full of men 20 years her junior and command every one of them within 90 seconds. Not through anything she said, but through the specific economy of her movements. The way she chose exactly where to stand, exactly when to make eye contact, and when to let it go. I want to be fair to her even now, even knowing everything I know. Jennifer had not been born into money. Her father had run a hardware store outside Winston-Salem that failed twice before it failed permanently. And she had told me once, early in our marriage, in a rare, unguarded moment on a rented beach porch, that she had grown up measuring her worth by how far she had traveled from the smell of that store. The specific mixture of machine oil and drywall dust that she said still caught in the back of her throat sometimes, for no reason at all. I had found that vulnerability moving once. I had held on to it as evidence of a person underneath the composure proof that the woman I loved was more than the polish she presented to conference rooms. What I did not understand for a very long time was that for Jennifer, distance from that hardware store was not a destination. It was a direction with no endpoint. A hunger that did not resolve itself no matter how far she traveled. Because the hunger had never actually been about money. We had, by any reasonable measure, everything. A 6,000 square foot house on 5 acres outside High Point that she had designed herself down to the pull of every cabinet hardware in the kitchen. A vacation property on Lake Norman we used 4 times a year. a title that put her name on the door of the second largest office in a company with 130 years of history behind it. 2 vehicles, both new, both hers, to choose without asking. A son who adored her. None of it had ever seemed to land anywhere. I noticed this most clearly at moments that should have registered as a rival: the night we closed on the lake house, the afternoon the board formally elevated her to vice president, her 50th birthday, which I had spent 8 months planning, down to flying in a string quartet from Charlotte, because she had mentioned once, years earlier, that she loved the sound of a cello played outdoors. She had smiled at all of it, thanked me graciously, performed exactly the gratitude the moment called for. And within a week, sometimes within days, I would catch her standing at the kitchen window with an expression I came to recognize, but could not for years correctly name. It was not sadness. It was closer to restlessness. The look of a woman scanning a horizon for something that kept refusing to arrive, no matter how much closer she got to it. There was a particular habit of hers I only understood in hindsight. Whenever a colleague or a friend mentioned a promotion, a new house, a larger office, something just slightly beyond what she currently held, I would watch her congratulate them warmly, generously even, and then watch something small and hard move behind her eyes. For the rest of that conversation, a private recalculation she never let surface in her voice. She did this with people she genuinely liked. She did it with me. On the rare occasions a competitor's owner made the local business paper for some acquisition or expansion I had not pursued. It was never envy exactly, not the crude kind. It was closer to an internal ledger she kept running at all times, measuring her position against everyone around her. And the ledger, I came to understand far too late, never once returned a result that satisfied her. I used to think it was simply her nature, an engine that could not idle. And for most of our marriage, I admired that quality more than I feared it. A man in my position values ambition. I had built my own life around the belief that wanting more in the right measure was the thing that kept a person and a company from calcifying. What I failed to understand, because I did not want to understand it, was that somewhere along the way, Jennifer's wanting had stopped attaching itself to anything I could offer her. Not the house, not the title, not even in the end the family we had built inside all of it. She had become a woman who could stand in the exact center of a life most people would have called extraordinary, and still feel with total sincerity that she was owed something more than this. I did not know yet what shape that something would take. I would learn 3 days after Elijah Diaz walked into our third-floor conference room for the first time that it had already taken a very specific shape indeed. And that shape had a name and an age and a voice he had clearly spent a great deal of time perfecting. Elijah Diaz joined Edwards Furniture Manufacturing as Director of Supply Chain in the spring of that year. Recruited away from a logistics firm in Charlotte with a compensation package that had made our Chief Financial Officer raise an eyebrow at the board meeting where it was approved. I had championed the hire myself. His resume was genuinely impressive. A decade of experience streamlining freight and materials sourcing for companies twice our size. And in his interview, he had walked me through a supply chain restructuring at his previous firm with the kind of fluent, confident detail that told me he actually understood the work rather than simply knowing how to talk about it. He was 47 years old, though he carried himself like a man who had decided that number was negotiable. 6'2", built with the kind of gym discipline that comes from a strict schedule rather than natural inheritance. Dark hair kept short and precise. A jaw he was clearly aware of. He dressed a half-step sharper than the job required. Tailored shirts with the sleeves rolled to exact and calculated point below the elbow. The kind of watch that costs more than most of our line workers make in 2 months. None of that alone would have concerned me. Plenty of capable men dress like they are trying to prove something. What I noticed, without fully registering why it mattered, was the way Elijah entered a room. He did not simply walk in. He arrived the way certain men learn to arrive, with a half-second pause at the threshold that ensured every head in the room turned before he took his first step forward. He had a laugh that came easily and often pitched exactly loud enough to be noticed without seeming to perform for anyone. And he had a particular talent, one I would come to understand far better in the months ahead, for identifying the one person in any gathering whose attention mattered most, and directing the full, undivided weight of his charm at exactly that person, so smoothly that everyone else in the room believed they were witnessing simple friendliness rather than a deliberate act of selection. I saw him do it 3 days after his first week in a coffee shop 2 blocks from our headquarters. The kind of place executives from half a dozen high-point companies used for meetings they preferred to have outside their own walls. I had stopped in for coffee before a lunch appointment I ended up canceling, and through the front window at a corner table, I saw my wife and my new director of supply chain sitting across from each other, with 2 coffees between them, and a stillness to the conversation that struck me, even from that distance, as different from the easy administrative chatter of 2 colleagues discussing freight contracts. I did not go in. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me, the part that had built 30 years of trust with the woman across that table, told me there was nothing here worth interrupting that. A vice president of operations meeting with a new director to discuss onboarding logistics was the most ordinary thing in the world. I stood on the sidewalk for perhaps 4 seconds, long enough to watch Elijah lean forward slightly and say something that made Jennifer laugh. Not her professional laugh, the one she deployed in board meetings to soften a hard number, but something looser, something I had not heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit. I remember the particular quality of light that afternoon, the kind of flat gray October sun that makes everything look slightly underexposed. And I remember the smell of roasted coffee beans through the propped door, mixing with exhaust from the street. And I remember thinking, in the strange, disconnected way a man thinks when he is standing very still while something inside him quietly rearranges itself, that I had not seen my wife's shoulders that relaxed in a work conversation in a very long time. Not with me, not in a meeting. Something about the ease of it, the total absence of performance, struck me as wrong in a way I could not yet articulate. The way a board feels wrong under your palm, a half-second before you notice the crack running through the grain. Then I got in my truck and drove to my lunch appointment, and did not think about it again for 11 days, which is exactly as long as it took for the 4th hairline crack to appear in a foundation I had spent 30 years assuming was solid all the way down. I would learn much later, from people who had no reason to lie to me, what Elijah had said to her that afternoon, and in the weeks that followed. Fragments of it, anyway, reconstructed from a woman at the coffee shop who occasionally overheard them and mentioned it months afterward to someone who eventually mentioned it to me. He had told Jennifer she was wasted in a company that would always see her as the founder's daughter-in-law, rather than the mind actually running its operations. He had told her that a woman with her instincts should be building something with her own name on it, not spending her considerable talent making someone else's legacy look good. He had used the phrase, "a future you actually deserve," more than once in more than one conversation, the way a skilled salesman returns to a phrase that has already proven it lands. It was, I would come to understand, a remarkably precise weapon, aimed by a man who had clearly done this before, at a woman who had spent 54 years believing that everything she already had was somehow still less than what she was owed. The 3rd contract was the Ashworth account, and losing it was the moment everything else finally demanded my attention. Because the Ashworth account was not the kind of business that simply walked away over a budget cycle. Ashworth Home Collections operated 42 furniture showrooms across the Southeast, and we had supplied their bedroom and dining lines for 11 years. a relationship my father had personally cultivated back when Ashworth was a six-store regional chain with more ambition than capital. I had renewed that contract myself 18 months earlier, a 5-year commitment worth just under $14 million annually. The kind of account you build a production schedule around. The kind you do not lose to a competitor without a very specific reason. The call came from Dennis Ashworth himself, the founder's son. A man I had known for 2 decades and trusted the way you trust someone who has never once given you cause not to. He was apologetic on the phone, genuinely so, and that was what unsettled me most. He told me a competitor out of Hickory, a mid-sized manufacturer called Blackwood Case Goods, that had never before come close to matching our pricing on comparable quality, had submitted a bid that undercut our renewal terms by nearly 12%, while matching our exact specifications down to the joinery details and finish tolerances we had spent years refining specifically for Ashworth's premium line. I want you to understand what that meant to a man who has spent 30 years in manufacturing. Pricing 12% below a competitor is difficult, but not impossible if you are willing to compress your margins. Matching our exact joinery specifications and finish tolerances on a proprietary line we had never published outside a small circle of senior staff and the client's own procurement team was not difficult. It was not possible at all. Unless someone inside one of those 2 circles had handed Blackwood Case Goods a copy of our production documents. I drove to the plant that evening instead of going home, and I sat in my office until nearly 10 with the Ashworth specification file open on my monitor, cross-referencing the access log our IT department kept for that particular document, a habit left over from years of tightening security around our proprietary designs. After a smaller incident with a different competitor a decade earlier. The log told me exactly what I was afraid it would tell me. 6 people had accessed that file in the past 4 months. 5 of them were engineers and production managers who had legitimate ongoing reasons to open it dozens of times. The 6th access, a single instance 11 weeks earlier, came from a login credential belonging to the Director of Supply Chain, a position that had no operational reason to open a joinery specification file for a client account he was not assigned to manage. I sat with that for a long time, the cursor blinking on a spreadsheet row that felt in the quiet of an empty office at 10 o'clock at night less like a data point and more like a small door swinging open onto a room I had not wanted to know existed inside my own company. I ran the access log 3 more times that night, the way you check a measurement twice before you trust it enough to cut. I told myself there could be an explanation I was not seeing, that supply chain occasionally needed visibility into specification files for logistics planning that 11 weeks earlier could have coincided with some legitimate onboarding review I had simply forgotten approving. I wanted very badly for there to be an explanation that did not require me to look any further. That is, I have come to believe one of the most dangerous wants a man can carry into an investigation of his own life. I called our IT director the next morning, under the pretext of a general security audit, careful to frame it as routine, and confirmed what the log had already told me. There was no supply chain protocol that required access to that file. There never had been. I did not confront anyone that night. I want to explain why, because it matters to everything that followed. A man who has run a manufacturing business for 3 decades learns that the difference between a costly accusation and a solved problem is almost always patience. The willingness to gather enough material before you cut, because wood that is cut before it is properly measured cannot be uncut afterward. I closed the file. I made a note of the date and the access record in a private folder I had never before had reason to create. The first entry in what would eventually become a record far more extensive than I could have imagined that night. And I drove home through a light October rain, running the numbers again and again, the way I used to run cost estimates on a job I could not afford to get wrong. until I arrived at a conclusion I still did not want to accept. Someone inside my own company, with access to information that should never have left this building, had helped a competitor take the largest contract we had signed in 3 years. And the only person whose credentials placed them inside that file, at a time and in a context that made no operational sense, was a man my wife had been meeting for coffee, 2 blocks from our headquarters, with a warmth I had spent 11 days trying not to think about. My father still came to Sunday dinner every week, a tradition that had outlasted 3 different dining room tables, and I suspect would outlast several more. Jennifer hosted these dinners with the same precision she brought to everything, and I want to be honest that even now, knowing everything I know, I remember those evenings as some of the only hours each week when our house felt entirely, uncomplicatedly, like a family, rather than 4 people orbiting separate lives under one roof. That particular Sunday came 4 days after I confirmed the access log with our IT director, and I had not yet said a word to anyone about what I had found. My father arrived at 6, as he always did, driven now by a home health aide named Rosa, who waited in the car with a paperback novel while he came inside. Because he had surrendered his car keys 18 months earlier with more grace than I had expected, and had told me at the time that a man who no longer trusted his own reflexes had no business pretending otherwise. He was 89 years old, and age had narrowed him, the way it narrows most men eventually. The broad shoulders I remembered from childhood settled now into something leaner, but his eyes had lost none of the particular sharpness that had made 3 decades of competitors underestimate him at their own expense. Billy was home from North Carolina State for the weekend. 20 years old, midway through an engineering degree he had chosen, he liked to remind us, entirely on his own, and not because his last name happened to be on the side of a manufacturing plant. He had Jennifer's dark hair and my mother's build, tall and a little unfinished, the way young men are at that age. And he spent most of dinner describing a senior design project involving stress tolerances and laminated beams, with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has not yet learned to hide how much he loves what he is learning. I watched him talk. I thought, not for the first time, that whatever else had gone wrong in this family, we had produced a genuinely good kid. And I held on to that thought the way you hold on to a level surface when everything else feels slightly tilted. My father listened to Billy with the same total attention he had once given every foreman's report on the shop floor, asking the occasional question that revealed he understood the engineering better than any of us gave him credit for. He had built this company on instinct as much as capital, but he had also spent 40 years reading everything he could find on materials science. And there was a version of my father I sometimes thought who would have made a fine engineer himself in a different decade, with different opportunities available to a boy from his side of town. Jennifer was radiant that evening, in a way I had noticed more frequently in recent months, and had, until 11 days earlier, simply attributed to her satisfaction with the direction of the company. She laughed easily at Billy's stories, refilled my father's water glass without being asked pointed, intelligent questions about his coursework that proved she had actually been listening rather than performing interest. Watching her across that table, animated and warm in the candlelight, I felt the particular vertigo of a man trying to hold 2 irreconcilable pictures of the same person in his mind at once. It was my father who noticed first, or rather, my father who said something about what he had noticed, because I have come to believe he had been watching Jennifer with quiet attention for considerably longer than that single dinner. He waited until Billy excused himself to take a call from a classmate, until Jennifer had risen to clear the dessert plates and carried them into the kitchen, until it was only the 2 of us at the table, with the candles burned low, and the particular stillness that settles over a house after a meal. He set down his coffee cup with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with his hands, which, despite his age, remained remarkably steady. "Logan," he said, his voice pitched low enough that it would not carry into the kitchen. "How many times this month has your wife mentioned Elijah Diaz's name at this table without you asking her a single question about him?" I did not have an answer ready. I sat there in the candlelight, running back through the past several dinners in my mind, and found, with a small, cold jolt, that the number was not small at all. My father was watching my face the way he used to watch a production line for the first sign of a fault patient. Unhurried, entirely certain he would eventually see what he was looking for. And when he saw it, whatever it was that crossed my expression in that moment, he nodded once, slowly. The particular nod of a man confirming something he had already suspected, and said the sentence that would not leave me alone for the rest of that week. "Son, I have seen this exact play before. Give me until Tuesday, and I will tell you when." I heard water running in the kitchen, the soft clatter of dessert plates being rinsed. And beneath it, faintly, Jennifer's voice, low and warm, saying something into her phone that I could not make out. She had not brought her phone to the table all evening. I had not thought anything of that either until just now. Tuesday came, and my father called me at exactly 7 in the morning before I had finished my coffee, which told me he had been awake considerably longer than that himself. "Come by the office before the plant opens," he said. "Not the conference room. Mine." His office at the back of the building had not changed meaningfully in 11 years. The same oak desk he had used since 1983. The same framed photograph of the original 1968 lathe hanging beside the door. The same particular smell of pipe tobacco that had soaked so deeply into the wood paneling that it remained, even though he had quit smoking a pipe 2 decades earlier. He was already seated when I arrived, a single manila folder squared precisely in the center of his desk. And he did not waste time on preamble, which was not his habit, even in the best of circumstances. In 1994, he said, "I built cabinetry components for a man named Harold Fitch, who ran a furniture shop about the size we were back then, over in Hickory. I did not know Harold well personally, but our paths crossed at trade shows for years, and eventually we became something like friends. The kind 2 competitors can afford to be when neither one is quite big enough yet to threaten the other. Harold had a son who came into the business in his late 20s, ambitious, restless, the kind of young man who believed his father's caution was simply a failure of nerve." My father paused there, his hands folded on the desk, and I understood he was choosing his next words with the same care he had once used to select lumber, testing each option before committing. "The son married a woman a few years later," he continued, "and she came to work in the office, handled the books. Eventually, same as your Jennifer did when she started out. Smart woman, sharp with numbers. And somewhere along the way, she got involved with a buyer who represented 3 of Harold's largest accounts. A man who had every reason in the world to keep those accounts happy, and no reason at all to be spending as much time in Harold's office as he apparently was." I felt something cold settle into my chest listening to him. The particular dread of hearing a story you already suspect is about to become a mirror. "Harold noticed the same way you're noticing," my father said. "Small things. Numbers that did not quite balance the way they should have. A pattern of orders that shifted just enough to benefit one particular supplier relationship the buyer happened to control. He did not have proof. He had instinct, and instinct alone will not hold up in a courtroom or a board meeting. And it certainly will not hold up against 2 people who have had months to build a story that sounds perfectly reasonable on its own." I asked him what happened to Harold's son, the one who had brought that woman into the business in the first place. And my father was quiet for a moment before he answered. The particular quiet of a man deciding how much of a hard truth a listener actually needs. "The son never fully recovered from it," he said. "Not the business. The business survived. The boy himself. He had built his whole sense of himself around trusting his own judgment and finding out he had been wrong about the person closest to him. Wrong for years without noticing, took something out of him that Harold told me never quite grew back. I want you to hear that clearly, Logan, because you are about to walk the same road. And the company surviving will not be the only thing that matters when this is finished. How you carry it will matter just as much. I sat with that for longer than I wanted to admit, because some part of me had already begun, without fully acknowledging it, mourning something that had not yet been officially declared lost. So what did he do? I asked, though some part of me already suspected the answer. The way you suspect the ending of a story your father has clearly told himself many times over the years, turning it into something closer to doctrine than memory. He built a trap, my father said, and for the first time that morning, something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. He drafted a specification document, deliberately flawed numbers that looked correct to anyone without deep technical knowledge, but were in fact calibrated wrong in a way that would be obvious only to someone checking them against the real production files. He shared that document with exactly one person in a private conversation, under the guise of asking her opinion before he finalized it. And he waited. 3 weeks later, the supplier that buyer favored submitted a bid to a mutual competitor using those exact flawed specifications, believing they had gotten hold of Harold's real numbers. There was only one place those numbers could have come from, because Harold had shown them to exactly one other person in the entire company. My father slid the manila folder across the desk toward me, and I opened it to find a single page inside blank, except for a header he had already typed at the top. Ashworth Home Collections, Revised Joinery Specification. Confidential. Logan, he said, his voice quiet but entirely without hesitation. The voice of a man who had waited 3 decades to use what he had learned, watching a friend save his company. We are going to build the same trap Harold built, and we are going to find out once and for all exactly whose hands these numbers pass through before they reach a competitor who has no business having them at all. Once you begin looking for a pattern, you cannot stop seeing it. The same way a bad weld becomes impossible to ignore once you know exactly where along the seam to look. In the days after my father handed me that folder, I found myself cataloging details about my own marriage with the same clinical attention I had once given to production defects. And the list, once I allowed myself to actually compile it rather than dismiss each item individually, was considerably longer than I wanted it to be. Jennifer had started working later, 3 or 4 evenings a week, always with a reasonable explanation attached. A vendor call that ran long, a quarterly report that needed another pass before the board meeting. I had believed every one of those explanations individually, because each one on its own was entirely plausible. It was only when I set them side by side that I noticed how consistently they clustered around evenings when Elijah's car, a black Audi he had leased the month he started, also remained in the executive lot past 7. She had changed the passcode on her phone in August. A small thing, the kind of security update everyone is told to do periodically. Except that she had also started keeping the phone face down on any surface where I might glance at it. A habit I did not recall from earlier years of our marriage, when she had left it face up on the kitchen counter without a second thought. I noticed, too, that she had begun taking it into the bathroom when she showered, setting it on the vanity within reach, something she explained once when I asked, as wanting to hear the morning news while she got ready. I had accepted that explanation for months. I no longer entirely believed it. There were smaller things still. The kind a man notices only once he has given himself permission to notice anything at all. She had started going to a new gym across town, rather than the one 3 minutes from our house, citing better equipment, though when I mentioned in passing that I might join her there sometime, she had changed the subject with a fluency that struck me in retrospect as slightly too practiced. She had bought 2 new dresses in October that I had never seen her wear, both still tagged in her closet when I happened to be looking for a suitcase. Both, I noted, with a discomfort I could not fully name, in a style considerably younger than anything else she owned. I noticed the perfume next, or rather, I noticed its absence, and then, some weeks later, its return in an entirely different form. Jennifer had worn the same scent for the better part of 2 decades, something Chanel had discontinued years ago that she rationed carefully from a bottle she kept refilling from a specialty importer online. Sometime in September, she had stopped wearing it altogether, and I had assumed, without much thought, that she had simply run out. In October, a new scent appeared. Warmer, sweeter, something I did not recognize and had certainly never bought her. And when I asked about it once, casually over dinner, she told me a colleague had recommended it, and she had decided she was ready for a change. I remember thinking at the time that people are allowed to want a change. I did not yet understand how much weight that particular sentence was carrying. I began keeping a private log of my own around this time. Not yet the formal documentation my father would eventually help me build, but a rough accounting in a notebook I kept in my truck rather than the house. Dates and small observations recorded in the kind of shorthand a man uses when he is not yet ready to admit, even to himself, exactly what he is building a case for. Late night, no explanation given, October the 11th. New perfume, unexplained origin, October the 4th. Gym membership declined my joining her October the 9th. Each entry felt, as I wrote it, like a small betrayal of the marriage itself, as though the act of documenting suspicion were somehow worse than the suspicion. None of it taken alone would have convinced a reasonable man of anything. I want to be honest about that, because I have thought about it many times since turning each individual piece of evidence over the way you turn a board looking for the grain direction. And I know that any one of these details could be explained by 100 innocent reasons. A phone habit, a new gym, a dress bought on impulse and never worn. It was only the accumulation, the sheer improbable weight of so many small changes arriving in the same narrow window of months, that finally tipped the scale from a husband's paranoia into something closer to certainty. I saw the message on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and I want to describe exactly how it happened, because I did not go looking for it, and I think that matters. Jennifer's phone was charging on the kitchen counter while she showered upstairs, and it lit up with an incoming text at the exact moment I walked past to refill my coffee. The screen illuminating for perhaps 2 seconds before going dark again, long enough for me to read 6 words before the display timed out. Miss you already. Same time Friday. I stood in my own kitchen at 7 in the morning, coffee pot still in my hand, and I felt something inside my chest that I can only describe as the specific sensation of a joint finally giving way under a load it had been quietly straining against for months. I did not confront Jennifer about the text message that Wednesday morning, and I want to explain that decision because I know it will strike some of you as a kind of cowardice. And I have turned that possibility over in my own mind more times than I care to admit. A man who has spent 30 years running a manufacturing company learns a particular discipline about the difference between reacting to a problem and solving one. A single text message, however damning it appeared, was not yet a foundation I could build anything permanent on. Jennifer was skilled in ways I was only beginning to fully appreciate at reframing evidence into innocence. I needed something she could not talk her way around, and I needed my father's trap in place before I gave her any reason to suspect I was looking. So I said nothing. I finished my coffee. I drove to the plant and spent the day behaving as best I could manage, like a man whose life had not just quietly come apart in his own kitchen. And I want you to understand what that cost. Because performing normalcy while your chest feels like a beam under a load it was never rated for is its own particular kind of labor. I signed off on production schedules. I sat through a budget review. I nodded at the appropriate moments in a conversation with our head of quality control. And not one person in that building, I am fairly certain, noticed anything different about me at all. Which told me something uncomfortable about how much of my life I had apparently already learned to perform without conscious effort. I thought more than once that day about my father's warning at his desk about Harold Fitch's son, and the thing that never quite grew back. I understood, sitting through that budget review with half my attention somewhere else entirely, that I was standing at the very beginning of that same road, and that the version of myself who walked out the other end of it would not be identical to the version who walked in. The Ashworth Trap document was scheduled to go into circulation the following Monday. But that Thursday, 3 days after the text message, an entirely separate problem arrived on my desk that I would only later understand was connected to everything else. We had a standing bid due to Coastal Living Furnishings, a 14-store chain based out of Wilmington that represented our second largest active negotiation, worth just over $9 million if we won the contract. Elijah, in his capacity overseeing supply chain costs, had submitted the final pricing sheet to our sales director for review, and the sales director, a careful man named Preston Hall, who had worked for us for 11 years and had never once made an error of this magnitude, called me directly, rather than sending an email, which told me immediately how serious he considered the problem. The pricing sheet Elijah submitted had transposed two critical figures: our per-unit material cost and our per-unit finishing cost. A mistake that, on its face, looked like simple carelessness, but that Preston, running the numbers himself twice over before calling me, determined would have resulted in us underbidding our own actual costs by roughly 18%, had it gone out uncaught. An error of that size on a bid that large does not happen by accident, to a man with Elijah's experience. It is the kind of mistake a first-year analyst makes, not a director who had spent a decade building his reputation on exactly this kind of precision. I called Elijah into my office that afternoon, and I watched him explain the error with a fluency that struck me even before I fully understood what I was looking at, as slightly too smooth for a man genuinely embarrassed by his own carelessness. He blamed a corrupted spreadsheet template, apologized with exactly the right measure of contrition, offered to have the corrected figures resubmitted within the hour. I nodded along. I thanked him for catching it, even though it was Preston who had caught it, not him. And I let him leave my office, believing he had successfully managed a minor embarrassment, rather than raised a serious question in my mind. I was still sitting at my desk 20 minutes later, running through the specific arithmetic of how convenient that particular error would have been for a competitor hoping to see our actual internal cost structure exposed through a public bid, when Alan Robinson knocked on my open door. Alan had run our warehouse and logistics floor for 19 years, a broad-shouldered man in his early 60s, with forearms that still looked like they belonged to someone who unloaded freight himself rather than simply supervised the people who did. He was not a man who came to my office uninvited. In 19 years, I could count on one hand the number of times he had done it, and every single one of those occasions had turned out to matter considerably more than his understated manner suggested at the time. He stood in the doorway for a moment without coming in, glancing once down the hallway behind him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was pitched low, the voice of a man who had spent several days deciding whether a thing was actually his business to mention at all. "Mr. Edwards," he said, "I need about 10 minutes, and I'd rather we close the door for it." I closed the door myself, rather than asking him to, and I gestured him toward the chair across from my desk, though he did not sit right away. Alan Robinson was a man who thought before he spoke and stood before he sat, a habit I had always associated with careful people, and watching him hesitate now in the middle of my office told me this was not going to be a small thing he had come to report. "Alan," I said, "sit down. Whatever this is, I'd rather hear it straight than watch you work up to it." He sat. He folded his hands together in his lap, forearms resting on his knees. And for a moment, he studied the floor between his boots, the way a man studies a decision he has already made, but still needs one final moment to fully commit to. "I've been running that warehouse floor for 19 years, he said finally. "And in that time, I've learned to read our shipping numbers the way some men read a weather report. I know what normal looks like on any given week, and I know within a day or two when something's drifted off from normal, even before I can tell you exactly why." He paused, and I let the silence sit, because I had learned long ago that Alan Robinson did not need prompting to get where he was going. "Starting back in August," he continued, "we began seeing delays on outbound freight that didn't match anything in our production schedule. Not big delays, small ones. A day here, 2 days there, always on shipments tied to our largest accounts. The Ashworth account, the Coastal Living account, a handful of others. Every single time, there was a documented reason in the system. A carrier scheduling conflict, a packaging material shortage that resolved itself within 48 hours. Nothing that would raise a flag on its own. "But you looked closer," I said. "I looked closer," he confirmed. "Because I noticed something else alongside those delays. Something that took me longer to put together, because it didn't live in the shipping system at all. Every one of those delayed shipments had one thing in common: the delay authorization. The paperwork that actually holds a truck at the dock instead of letting it roll on schedule had been entered by the same login credential every single time. Elijah Diaz's account." I felt my jaw tighten. The same particular tension I had felt reading the specification access log 11 days earlier. The sensation of a suspicion crossing over into something with actual weight behind it. "Now," Alan said, holding up one broad hand as if to slow me down before I drew a conclusion faster than he was ready to support. "A supply chain director authorizing a shipping delay isn't itself unusual. That's within his role. What's unusual is the pattern. Every delay landed right before a competitor's sales team made contact with that same client. I only know that because Dennis Ashworth's warehouse manager is an old friend of mine, and he mentioned to me, just in passing, that Blackwood's rep had called Ashworth's office the exact same week we delayed a shipment that client had been waiting 3 weeks for." He reached into his shirt pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper, worn soft at the creases from being carried and unfolded several times, and set it on the edge of my desk without pushing it any closer. The gesture of a man offering something rather than presenting it. It was a handwritten list, dates down one column, shipment numbers down the next, and in the third column, in Alan's small, careful print, the client name attached to each delay. 7 entries in total, spanning back to early August. Every single one tied to an account we had either lost outright or watched grow strangely difficult to retain. "I've been keeping this on my own time," he said. "Didn't want it sitting in any company system where somebody might have reason to go looking through my files, the way I imagine somebody's been looking through other things around here." I sat back in my chair, the full shape of what Alan was describing settling into place, alongside everything else I had already gathered. My father's trap, the flawed pricing sheet, the text message on Jennifer's phone. Each piece a separate board that laid side by side was beginning to reveal the outline of a structure I had not wanted to believe anyone could have built inside my own company. "I don't like bringing you something like this without being certain," Alan said, his voice dropping lower still. "But I've watched you build things the right way for a long time, Mr. Edwards. The way your father built things before you. I wasn't going to sit on this and let somebody take it apart from the inside without at least telling you what I was seeing." I thanked him, and I meant it more deeply than the 2 words could carry. And after he left my office, I sat alone for a long time, with my hand resting flat on the closed folder my father had given me, understanding that the trap we had built for Monday was no longer simply a test. It was the last piece of a case that had, without my fully realizing it, already assembled itself around me from every direction at once. A wife's changed habits, a director's convenient errors, a loyal foreman's quiet handwritten list carried in a shirt pocket because he trusted no system inside these walls enough to hold it for him. I understood, sitting there in the last gray light of that afternoon, that I had reached the point past which patience alone would no longer serve me, and that whatever came next would require me to become a different kind of man than the one who had walked into this office that morning. I could not sleep that night, and I did not particularly try. Jennifer had gone to bed at 10, unremarkable, unhurried, kissing my cheek in the hallway with a warmth that I now understood, watching it from the outside, of my own suspicion as either a genuinely unconscious habit or the most disciplined performance I had ever witnessed in 30 years of marriage. I told her I had some numbers to look over before the Ashworth trap went out Monday, which was not a lie, simply not the complete truth. And she had accepted it without a second glance, the way she accepted most of my late evenings, because a wife who is occupied with her own secrets rarely questions her husband's stated need for privacy. The house was quiet, in the particular way a house is quiet only after midnight. The refrigerator cycling on somewhere below me, a floorboard settling in the hallway the way it always did once the temperature dropped a few degrees after dark. I remember sitting there in the lamplight for a long moment before I even opened the laptop, listening to that quiet, thinking about how many nights over 30 years I had fallen asleep in this house, believing I understood every load-bearing wall in the life we had built inside it. I did not yet know how wrong that belief was. I was about to find out. I sat in my home office with the door closed and my laptop open, and I began where Alan's list had left off, cross-referencing the client names on his handwritten sheet against publicly available business registration records for Blackwood Case Goods, the hickory manufacturer that had taken the Ashworth contract out from under us. On the surface, Blackwood was exactly what it appeared to be, a mid-sized furniture manufacturer that had been operating for 18 years under stable ownership. Nothing about the parent company itself raised any flags. It was the vendor registry that caught my attention. The public record North Carolina requires certain companies to maintain, listing any consulting or brokerage entities they contract with above a specific dollar threshold. Blackwood had, over the past 8 months, paid consulting fees totaling just under $210,000 to a company called Meridian Sourcing Partners, LLC, for what the filing described only as market intelligence and client acquisition services. I typed that name into a search engine and found almost nothing. No website, no listed employees on any professional networking platform. A single registration filed with the North Carolina Secretary of State 11 months earlier, listing a registered agent service in Raleigh rather than an actual named individual. The kind of arrangement people use specifically when they do not want their own name easily connected to a company's public paperwork. I sat with that for a long moment, the cursor blinking in the search bar, feeling the particular cold clarity that comes to a man very late at night, when a shape he has been circling for weeks finally resolves into something with edges. 11 months, I thought. Meridian Sourcing Partners had been registered 11 months earlier. Elijah Diaz had joined our company as Director of Supply Chain almost exactly 11 months earlier. I did not yet have proof connecting the two, nothing that would hold up to the kind of scrutiny my father's careful mind would demand before he believed it himself. But I had something considerably more dangerous than proof at that hour of the morning. I had a timeline, and a timeline, once you see it clearly, is very difficult to unsee. I spent the next 2 hours working through every public filing I could access. North Carolina business registration records, the Secretary of State's corporate database, a property records search that cost me $40 and returned nothing useful, and a professional licensing lookup that returned exactly one thread worth pulling. The registered agent service in Raleigh that had filed Meridian's paperwork had processed only 6 other business registrations in the same calendar month, an unusually small number for a firm that specialized in exactly this kind of anonymous filing work. I wrote down all 6 names, thinking one of them might eventually connect to something useful, without any real expectation that I would recognize any of them. The 4th name on that list was Ross Consulting Group, LLC, registered on the exact same day as Meridian Sourcing Partners, at the exact same Raleigh address, by the exact same registered agent. Ross had been Jennifer's maiden name. I sat in my home office at nearly 3 in the morning, with my hands flat on the desk on either side of my laptop, staring at a screen that had just confirmed something I had spent weeks trying not to fully believe. And I understood, with the particular finality of a board finally splitting clean along a grain you had suspected was compromised from the very first cut, that this had never been Elijah Diaz acting alone. My wife had built this alongside him from the very beginning, with her own name folded carefully enough into the paperwork that only a man willing to spend 3 hours awake at his desk at 3 in the morning would ever have found it at all. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that, because I think there is an expectation that a moment like this should break a man open in some visible way. And it did not that night. What I felt instead was something closer to the specific stillness that follows a diagnosis. The particular quiet after a doctor finally names the thing you had already, on some unspoken level, known was there. I closed the laptop. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the house breathe around me. And somewhere in that stillness, I understood that I was no longer simply investigating a business problem. I was gathering the case I would eventually have to bring not just to a boardroom, but to a courtroom, and possibly, though I was not yet ready to fully accept it, to a divorce attorney as well. I did not go to bed that night at all. I sat in my office until the window behind my desk went from black to the particular gray that comes an hour before actual light. And somewhere in that long stretch of stillness, I made the decision that would shape everything that followed. I was not going to carry this alone any further. I called my father at 6 in the morning, earlier than I had ever called him in my life, outside of genuine emergencies, and when he answered on the second ring, fully alert, I understood he had likely been awake for hours already, the way older men often are. "I need to come see you," I said. "Now, if that's all right." He did not ask why. He simply said the door's unlocked, and hung up. My father lived alone in the same house he and my mother had bought in 1971, a modest brick ranch on the edge of town that he had refused to leave, despite every suggestion from well-meaning friends that a man his age would be better served by something smaller, something with fewer stairs and less yard to maintain. He kept the place immaculate, through a combination of Rose's help and his own stubborn insistence on doing what he still could himself. He was sitting at his kitchen table when I arrived, 2 cups of coffee already poured, one across from him at the place I had occupied at that table since I was a boy. The kitchen smelled the way it always had, coffee and the faint trace of my mother's dish soap, a brand he had never switched away from in the 11 years since she passed. And I remember thinking, walking through that familiar doorway with a folder full of my own marriage's evidence under my arm, how strange it was that grief and betrayal could occupy the same small house, so quietly, decades apart, and still feel like the same weight, settling onto the same worn floorboards. I set the folder down between us, the one containing everything I had gathered, the specification access log, Alan's handwritten shipping list, the printed business registration records, and I told him everything. The text message, the timeline, the Raleigh registered agent, the name Ross, sitting at the bottom of a filing that had nothing to do with fabric or furniture at all. I watched my father's face as I spoke, and I want to tell you honestly that I have rarely seen him look the way he looked in that kitchen. Not surprised exactly, but grieved in a way that went deeper than simple disappointment. The specific grief of a man watching a fear he had quietly carried for weeks finally confirm itself in full. He read through the documents, slowly, methodically, the same way he had once reviewed every production contract before signing it. And when he finished, he set the folder down and folded his hands on the table, and was quiet for what felt like a very long time. "I am sorry, son," he said finally. "I hoped I was wrong about how far this went. I truly did." I told him I had hoped the same thing, and I meant it more than any sentence I had spoken in weeks. He asked me then the question I had been avoiding asking myself with any real honesty since the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. "What do you want to do about it?" I did not have a clean answer. Some part of me wanted to walk into the plant that morning and confront both of them in front of the entire senior staff, to let the humiliation land exactly where it belonged, and let the consequences fall however they fell. Another part of me, the part that had spent 30 years learning patience from the man sitting across this table, understood that anger deployed too early accomplishes nothing except warning your opponent to hide the rest of what they have built. I said as much, and my father nodded slowly, the particular nod of a man confirming that his son had, despite everything, learned the right lesson from him after all. "We are not ready yet," he said. "What you have is enough to raise questions. It is not yet enough to end this cleanly, in a way that protects the company, protects Billy, and gives you the kind of ground to stand on that nobody can talk their way out from under. Elijah's supply chain trap goes out Monday as planned. That will give us the technical proof. But I want more than technical proof before we move. I want to understand exactly how much they have taken, exactly how deep this runs, and exactly who else may know about it before we ever open our mouths." He reached across the table and placed his hand, weathered and steady, despite 89 years of use, over mine. "Logan," he said, "this is going to take longer than you want it to. It is going to require you to sit across a dinner table from your wife and in a plant hallway from a man who has been quietly working to destroy everything 3 generations of this family built, and give away nothing of what you now know. That is the hardest kind of work there is, harder than any cut you have ever made in that shop. But I will be beside you for every part of it, and when the time comes, I promise you, we will not just catch them. We will make certain there is nowhere left standing for either one of them to run to." The Ashworth Trap document went into circulation on Monday morning, exactly as planned. And I want to walk you through precisely how we built it, because the mechanics of it mattered enormously to what came after. My father and I worked through that weekend at his kitchen table, the same table where I had laid out my evidence 3 days earlier, drafting a revised joinery specification for a hypothetical new Ashworth product line, one we had genuinely been discussing internally for months, which gave the document a legitimate business context that would not itself raise suspicion. Within that specification, we altered 4 critical measurements, tolerances, on a structural joint that, if actually manufactured to those numbers, would have produced furniture that failed under normal use within a matter of months. The changes were subtle enough that anyone without deep technical knowledge of our joinery standards would never notice them. They were significant enough that any competitor attempting to reverse engineer our actual production process from these numbers would build something fundamentally, catastrophically wrong. I shared the document with exactly one person inside the company, in a private one-on-one meeting I scheduled with Jennifer, under the entirely legitimate pretext of reviewing operational logistics for a potential new product line, before I brought it to the full senior staff. I watched her study it with her usual careful attention, asking 2 intelligent questions about production timeline that had nothing to do with the specifications themselves. And I want to tell you honestly that sitting across from her in that meeting, watching her engage with a document I knew to be a deliberate trap, was one of the strangest experiences of my adult life. 30 years of marriage does not simply switch off because you have learned something devastating about the person across the table. Some part of me still wanted her explanations to be true. Some part of me was still, even then, hoping I had somehow gotten this catastrophically wrong. She thanked me for including her in the review, told me the numbers looked solid, and asked, almost in passing, whether I planned to loop in supply chain before finalizing costs. I told her not yet, that I wanted senior leadership's eyes on it first, and she nodded and moved on to the next item on her calendar, with no visible change in her demeanor at all. I did not share that document with anyone else. Not Preston Hall, not Alan Robinson, not a single other person inside Edwards Furniture Manufacturing had access to those specific altered numbers. Which meant that if they surfaced anywhere outside this building, there was exactly one path they could have traveled to get there. 12 days passed, with nothing to report. 12 days during which I sat through senior staff meetings and Sunday dinners and quiet evenings at home, performing a version of my own life that felt more each day like standing on a floor I no longer trusted to hold my weight. My father called every evening at 8, a habit that had not existed before this, checking in with a single question that never varied. Anything yet? I told him no, 12 times running. And each time I could hear him weighing whether 12 days without a bite meant the trap had failed, or simply that patience required more of it than either of us wanted to give. Those 12 days were, in their own way, harder than anything that came before or after them. I found myself watching Jennifer across the dinner table with a kind of double vision I had never experienced in my life. One part of me still automatically responding to her the way a husband of 30 years responds, reaching for the salt when she asked, laughing at a genuinely funny story about her sister. And another part of me standing slightly apart from all of it, cataloging every gesture for some sign of guilt or calculation that never quite surfaced clearly enough to be certain of anything. She slept beside me those 12 nights with the same steady breathing she always had. She kissed me goodbye in the mornings with what still infuriatingly felt like genuine affection. I began to understand during that stretch of waiting exactly how a person capable of what I suspected Jennifer capable of could function so seamlessly inside an ordinary life. Compartmentalization, I came to believe, was not a failure of character in someone like her. It was the entire architecture the deception depended on. On the 13th day, Preston Hall forwarded me an email he had received from a contact at a regional furniture trade publication, a routine industry newsletter that occasionally previewed upcoming product announcements from manufacturers across the Southeast. Buried in a paragraph about several companies debuting new lines at the spring furniture market was a single sentence describing an unnamed Hickory-based manufacturer's new joint venture into a premium bedroom collection featuring, the newsletter noted, with the kind of specificity that meant someone had shared actual technical details with the reporter. A distinctive structural joinery approach that sources described as remarkably similar to designs currently used by at least one established regional competitor. I read that paragraph 4 times before I fully understood what I was looking at. Blackwood Case Goods, the same company that had taken the Ashworth contract, was already quietly briefing trade press on a product line built around joinery specifications that existed nowhere in the world except inside a single document I had personally handed to exactly one person 12 days earlier in a private meeting with my own wife. I called my father that night before he had a chance to ask his usual question. Something bit, I told him. And I think it just told us everything we needed to know. Something bit was accurate as far as it went. But my father was careful that same night on the phone to remind me that a bite was not yet a catch. What we had was strong circumstantial evidence that confidential specifications had traveled from a private meeting with Jennifer to a competitor's product development team. It was not, on its own, sufficient to prove the full scope of what I suspected. The affair itself, the extent of the financial arrangement between Jennifer and Elijah, whether Meridian Sourcing Partners and Ross Consulting Group had actually exchanged money with Blackwood, or simply shared information for some other benefit I had not yet identified. I remember lying awake that night, turning his words over, understanding the practical wisdom in them, even as some exhausted part of me wanted nothing more than to already be finished with all of it, to already be standing on the other side of whatever confrontation was coming, rather than still in the long corridor leading toward it. 30 years of running a business had taught me the value of gathering complete information before acting. It had not, I was discovering, made the waiting itself any easier to bear when the subject under investigation was the woman sleeping beside me. My father is the one who suggested Bruce Barnes, a name he had carried for years from his own decades of business dealings. A private investigator who had done careful, quiet work for 2 other manufacturing families in the region during disputes, considerably more delicate than the average infidelity case. I called Bruce on a Tuesday afternoon from my truck in the plant parking lot, away from any office where a conversation might be overheard, and he agreed to meet me that same evening at a diner off Business 69, a location he chose specifically, he told me later, because it had no cameras, worth mentioning, and a back booth with a clear line of sight to both exits. Bruce Barnes was somewhere in his late 50s, built solid rather than large, with the unremarkable, forgettable face of a man who had spent 30 years cultivating exactly that quality, on purpose. He had spent 2 decades with the Greensboro Police Department before going private, he told me, specializing now almost entirely in corporate and matrimonial investigations for clients who needed absolute discretion and could afford to pay for it. He listened to my entire account without interrupting once, taking notes in a small spiral notebook, with handwriting so compressed it looked almost like its own private code. And when I finished, he set down his pen and looked at me with an expression that was neither sympathetic nor clinical, simply direct. "Mr. Edwards," he said, "I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. In my experience, when a man brings me evidence this organized, this documented, the underlying situation is almost always worse than what he's already found, not better. I'm not telling you that to alarm you. I'm telling you because I'd rather you hear it from me now than be blindsided by it in 3 weeks." I told him I understood, though I am not certain, looking back, that I did. He took the case that night, working under a retainer structured through Margaret's office, our family attorney, rather than directly through the company. A precaution my father insisted on to keep any findings properly protected under attorney-client privilege. From the very beginning, Bruce's plan was straightforward in its outline, and I would learn considerably more meticulous in its execution. Surveillance on Jennifer's movements during the specific windows I had already identified. The late evenings the new gym she visited alone cross-referenced against Elijah's own patterns, along with a deeper financial trace on both Meridian Sourcing Partners and Ross Consulting Group, following the money in ways that public filings alone could never fully reveal. 9 days later, on a Thursday morning, Bruce called and asked to meet in person rather than discuss anything over the phone. A request that told me, before he said another word, that he had found exactly what he had warned me he might find. He met me again at the same back booth, the same clear line of sight to both exits, and this time he did not open with a warning. He simply slid a plain manila envelope across the table, the kind with no markings at all, and waited while I opened it with hands that were, I noticed, distantly, not quite steady. Inside were 4 photographs, time-stamped dated 11 days apart, across 2 separate occasions, taken from a car parked at a discreet distance from a hotel, just off Interstate 40 near Winston-Salem. In the first photograph, Jennifer was getting out of her own car in the hotel parking lot at 4 in the afternoon on a Friday. In the second, Elijah's black Audi pulled in 9 minutes later. In the third and fourth, taken through a long lens from across the lot, the two of them were walking together toward a side entrance, his hand resting at the small of her back, with the particular familiarity of a gesture practiced many times before. Her head tilted toward him, in a posture I recognized instantly and painfully, as one she had once, a very long time ago, reserved only for me. I sat in that booth for a long time, without saying anything, the diner's fluorescent light humming overhead, the smell of burnt coffee and grill smoke settling into the silence between Bruce and me. While I looked at 4 pieces of glossy paper that had just quietly ended 30 years of a marriage I had spent most of my adult life believing was the one truly solid thing I had built. Bruce did not rush me. He simply sat across the table, patient, in the particular way of a man who had delivered this exact kind of silence to a great many other kitchen tables and diner booths over the course of his career, and waited for me to be the one who spoke first. I drove home from that diner the long way, taking the back roads through farmland rather than the highway, because I was not yet fit to be behind a wheel in traffic, and I needed the extra 20 minutes to arrange my face into something that would not immediately tell Jennifer the moment I walked through our front door exactly what I had spent that evening looking at. I want to describe what grief for a living marriage actually feels like, because I do not think people who have not experienced it understand that it is genuinely a form of grief, not merely anger or humiliation, though both of those were present too. It is the specific mourning of a future you had already, without fully realizing it, spent years quietly building in your mind. Retirement trips you had discussed over dinner, the version of yourself at 70, sitting on a porch somewhere, with the same woman you had raised a son alongside, growing old inside a partnership you believed, with the same unthinking certainty you believed the sun would rise, was permanent. That future did not simply end when I saw those photographs. It had already ended weeks or months earlier, on some afternoon I could not identify, in a hotel room off Interstate 40. What the photographs did was force me to finally attend the funeral for something that had in truth already died sometime before. I thought about our wedding, held in the backyard of Jennifer's mother's house in Winston-Salem. 26 years old and so certain of everything that certainty itself felt like a kind of achievement. I thought about the night Billy was born. Jennifer, exhausted and radiant in a hospital bed, reaching for my hand before she had even fully opened her eyes, saying my name before she said his. I thought about 100 smaller moments that had, until that evening, simply existed as the unremarkable texture of an ordinary good life. Her hand finding mine without looking during a boring dinner party. The specific way she used to leave notes on my truck's dashboard. During the early years of the company, when I left before she woke. The two of us standing in a hospital hallway when my mother passed. Her arm around my shoulders, holding me together in a way I had never had to question. I did not know, driving those back roads in the dark, how much of that was real, and how much of it I had simply been permitted to believe was real, by a woman who had at some point, I could not pinpoint, begun treating our entire life together as a structure to be quietly hollowed out from the inside, while its exterior remained standing for everyone else to admire. I thought of a house my crews had once been called to repair years ago, back when I still occasionally walked job sites myself. A beautiful colonial whose owners had no idea that termites had spent a decade eating through the interior framing, while the painted exterior gave no outward sign of anything wrong at all. You could stand on that lawn and admire the house for years without ever suspecting what was happening inside its walls. I understood that night that I had been standing on my own lawn for longer than I wanted to calculate, admiring a structure that had already been quietly failing from within. I understood arriving finally at our driveway with the porch light glowing the way it always did, that I had reached the point where the investigation had to become something more than fact-finding. It had become, whether I wanted it to be or not, the architecture of the rest of my life. The case that would determine not only what happened to the company my grandfather built, but what happened to me, to Billy, to whatever came after this. I did not confront her that night. I sat in my truck in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes before going inside, and I made myself a promise in that stillness that I intend to keep telling you about honestly for the rest of this story. I would not let my own pain rush this into a mistake. Harold Fitch's son had confronted too early, my father had told me once, weeks before I fully understood why that detail mattered. And the confrontation itself had given his wife and her buyer enough warning to destroy evidence before it could ever be properly gathered. I was not going to make that same error. Whatever it cost me to sit across from Jennifer at our own kitchen table, knowing what I now knew, and say nothing, I was going to pay that cost willingly, because the alternative was letting her walk away with half the truth still buried where no one would ever find it. I went inside. Jennifer was in the kitchen reading something on her phone with a small, private smile that I now understood with a clarity that made my chest ache in an entirely new way was very likely not meant for me at all. She looked up when I came in, asked how my evening with clients had gone. The cover story I had given her for the meeting with Brusand. I told her it had gone fine, that I was tired, that I was going to turn in early. I climbed the stairs to our bedroom that night and lay beside a woman I had loved for 30 years, listening to her breathing settle into sleep beside me. And I understood, staring at the ceiling in the dark, that I was no longer simply her husband. I had become, without ever choosing, the role, the one person in her carefully constructed life who now knew exactly how much of it was built on nothing at all. My father called Mary Collins into this the following week, and I want to tell you a little about her, because without Mary, a significant piece of what we eventually brought forward would simply never have existed at all. Mary had worked as my father's executive assistant for 31 years, since 1993, back when the company still occupied half the space it does now, and my father still answered his own phone most mornings. She had stayed on in a reduced capacity after his retirement from daily operations, technically reporting to our current executive assistant pool, but functionally still answering directly to him for anything he considered important enough to ask her about personally. She was 67 years old, precise in a way that had nothing performative about it. The kind of precision that comes from genuinely caring whether a filing system makes sense, rather than simply wanting to appear organized. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain she had made herself during a craft class at her church, and she kept a small dish of butterscotch candies on her desk that had been there as far as I knew, for as long as I had been walking these hallways as a boy trailing after my father on weekend visits to the plant. She had, my father told me once, forgotten more about how this company actually ran than most of our current senior staff had ever learned. He called her into his office on a Tuesday morning, and without excessive explanation, asked her to do something that fell well outside any job description she had held in 3 decades of employment. He asked her to quietly compile a complete archive of every email sent and received through Elijah Diaz's company account since his hire date, using her own long-standing administrative access to the system, an access level that predated our current IT security protocols and had simply never been revoked, because no one had ever thought to question why Arthur Edwards's assistant still had it. Mary did not ask why, my father told me later, which did not surprise me in the slightest once I understood the full history between them. She had apparently quietly suspected something was wrong for weeks already, having noticed her own small inconsistencies in scheduling and correspondence that she had not felt it was her place to raise unprompted. She simply nodded, said she would need a few days to do it properly, without drawing attention to what she was doing, and began the work that same afternoon. What Mary understood and what made her work so valuable was the danger of doing this visibly. A formal IT request to archive another employee's email account would have generated a log entry, a record that Elijah or anyone monitoring system activity on his behalf could potentially notice. Mary instead worked manually, exporting individual email threads during quiet hours, using her existing legitimate access, saving them to an external drive she kept in a locked drawer of her own desk, rather than anywhere on the company network, building the archive one careful export at a time over the better part of a week, without ever triggering a single alert. She brought what she had found to my father's office on a Friday afternoon, and he called me immediately, his voice carrying an urgency I had rarely heard from him, even during this entire ordeal. I drove to the plant within 20 minutes. Mary had organized the material with the same meticulous care she brought to everything printed and tabbed. A timeline constructed from Elijah's actual correspondence rather than the circumstantial evidence we had assembled up to that point. Buried among routine supply chain communications were 7 email exchanges spanning 4 months between Elijah's personal account, not his company address, and a contact identified only as a name I did not recognize, at an address ending in a domain registered to Blackwood case goods. The language in those emails was careful coded, in the way people write when they suspect correctly that what they are doing would end their careers and possibly land them in a federal courtroom if it were ever read by the wrong person. But careful language, read alongside a timeline of contract losses and specification leaks, was no longer ambiguous. One email, dated the week before we lost the Ashworth account, referenced a finder's fee structure tied to successful client transitions. Another 3 weeks later confirmed receipt of what the sender called the second installment, with a dollar figure attached that made my stomach turn. $45,000 paid in that single installment alone. I looked up from the page at my father, and I asked him the question that had been building in me for weeks, the one I had not fully allowed myself to voice until that moment. How much money are we actually talking about here? Across all of it. My father's face when he answered had the particular stillness of a man delivering a number he had already done the arithmetic on privately, and had been dreading having to say out loud. Based on what Mary found so far, he said, and what Bruce is still tracing through the shell companies, I would estimate no less than $300,000 has already changed hands. And Logan, I do not believe for one moment that this is finished. I believe we have found the beginning of it, not the end. Bruce Barnes called 3 days after Mary's email archive landed on my father's desk, and this time he asked to meet at my father's house rather than the diner. A shift in location that told me before he arrived that whatever he had found was significant enough that he no longer wanted to discuss it anywhere, with even the remotest chance of being overheard. He arrived with a laptop and a folder considerably thicker than the one he had shown me weeks earlier, and he spread its contents across my father's kitchen table with the particular efficiency of a man who had done this exact presentation many times before for many other devastated families. I have traced the full financial structure now, he said, and I want to walk you through it slowly, because the mechanics matter for what comes next. Whether you decide to handle this through law enforcement, civil litigation, or both. He laid out the architecture, piece by piece. Meridian Sourcing Partners and Ross Consulting Group, the 2 shell entities registered on the same day through the same Raleigh agent, functioned as pass-through accounts, receiving payments from Blackwood case goods, labeled as consulting fees, and immediately redistributing the majority of those funds into 2 personal accounts. One held jointly by Jennifer under a maiden name banking relationship she had apparently maintained quietly for years, without my knowledge, and one held individually by Elijah at a credit union in Winston-Salem. The total, once Bruce finished tracing every transaction across 8 months, came to $412,000. Considerably more than my father's earlier estimate. Funneled from Blackwood into those two shell companies, and out again into personal accounts, timed consistently to land within days of each contract we lost, or each shipment Alan had documented as delayed without cause. But the money itself, Bruce said, setting down one final document, is not actually the most damaging piece of what I found. He turned his laptop toward us, opening an email thread he had recovered through what he described only as a legally obtained records request tied to the shell company's registered agent. Careful in his phrasing, in the particular way of a man who wanted us to understand the evidence was clean, without explaining every technical detail of how he had gotten it. The thread was between Elijah and a Blackwood executive named Carl Whitfield, dated 4 months earlier, discussing what they referred to only as the transition timeline. In it, Elijah wrote something that I have read so many times since that I could recite it without looking. Jennifer is confident she can have full operational control within 18 months, once the old man's health gives Logan a reason to step back or step down. After that, transitioning our remaining accounts becomes considerably easier to justify internally. I read that sentence 3 times before its full meaning settled into place. This had never simply been about an affair, or even simply about a competitor stealing contracts. Jennifer had been positioning herself patiently and deliberately to eventually take control of the company itself, waiting for some future point when my father's health, or perhaps my own, diminished trust in my own judgment after this was finished, might create an opening for her to argue she was the more capable steward of what 3 generations of my family had built. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift in the room that had nothing to do with temperature. Every small kindness Jennifer had shown my father over the years, the patience she brought to his stories at Sunday dinner, the careful way she always made certain his coffee was exactly how he liked it, arranged itself suddenly into a different pattern in my mind. No longer warmth, but reconnaissance. No longer love, but the long, patient work of a woman studying exactly where the foundation of an old man's trust could eventually be made to give way. I did not know, sitting at that table, whether that reframing was entirely fair to her. I only knew that I could no longer tell the difference between genuine affection and calculated positioning in anything she had done for longer than I wanted to admit. My father read the same sentence over my shoulder and was silent for a long moment before he spoke. And when he did, his voice carried a coldness I had rarely heard from him in my entire life. "We are done gathering," he said. "It is time to bring in Liam." Liam Carter had been our family's attorney for 19 years. A careful, exacting man in his early 50s who had handled everything from our corporate contracts to my own will. Known throughout High Point's business community for a reputation so thoroughly unflashy that clients sometimes mistook his caution for a lack of aggression. Right up until the moment they watched him dismantle an opposing counsel's entire case with nothing more than patient, methodical questioning. My father called him that same evening, laying out everything we had assembled in a conversation that ran past midnight. Liam arrived at the plant the following morning before regular business hours, and I watched him work through Bruce's documentation, Mary's email archive, and my own original evidence, with the particular quiet intensity of a man calculating exactly how much legal exposure 2 people had created for themselves. "Mr. Edwards," he said finally, closing the final folder and looking directly at me, "what you have assembled here is not simply grounds for divorce or termination. This is a documented case of corporate espionage, wire fraud, and what very likely constitutes a conspiracy to seize control of a privately held company through fraudulent means. I want to bring in a colleague who specializes specifically in white-collar criminal referrals. Because, Logan, I believe what we do next needs to involve federal authorities, not just civil court." There was one more piece Liam wanted before we moved forward. And it was in some ways the piece that mattered most to me personally. separate from the legal architecture Bruce and Mary had already built. He wanted direct confirmation from our largest active client, Coastal Living Furnishings, of exactly how Elijah had approached the relationship in the months leading up to the near-catastrophic pricing error. Because a client's own account, given willingly and outside any pressure from us, would carry weight in a federal proceeding that internal documents alone could not fully replicate. I called Patricia Ramirez myself rather than delegating it to Preston Hall, because after everything that had happened, I no longer trusted any conversation involving this relationship to travel through channels I could not personally verify. Patricia was Coastal Living's vice president of merchandising, a woman in her late 40s who had built her entire 14-store chain's furniture program around long-term manufacturer relationships, rather than the constant vendor switching that had become common in the industry. And she had worked with Edwards Furniture Manufacturing for 6 years, long enough that our conversations had developed the easy directness of people who trusted each other's word without needing it dressed up. I asked if I could come to Wilmington in person rather than discuss this over the phone, and she agreed without asking why, which told me something about the quality of trust we had built together over those 6 years. Trust I was determined, whatever else happened, not to lose through anything that had gone wrong inside my own walls. The drive to Wilmington took just under 3 hours, and I spent most of it thinking about how strange it was to be protecting a business relationship with the same fierce attention I once would have reserved only for protecting my marriage, as though the two categories of trust had somewhere along the way quietly traded places in my sense of what actually mattered. I had known Patricia only through boardrooms and quarterly reviews, and yet in that moment, I found myself more afraid of disappointing her professional confidence in me than I had been of almost anything else in this entire ordeal. Perhaps because her trust, unlike Jennifer's affection, had never once given me reason to doubt it. We met in her office on a Thursday afternoon, and I told her in careful, general terms that Liam had helped me prepare, that I was conducting an internal review related to some irregularities in how certain accounts had been managed, and that her honest recollection of recent interactions with our supply chain director would be genuinely helpful to that review. Patricia sat back in her chair and was quiet for a moment. And then she said something that confirmed, in a single sentence, everything Bruce and Mary's evidence had already suggested. "Logan," she said, "I have to tell you, I've been a little uneasy about this myself, and I'm relieved you're asking, because I wasn't sure it was my place to bring it up." She told me that over the past several months, Elijah had begun contacting her directly, rather than routing communications through Preston, our sales director, which was itself unusual, given that Elijah's role had no standard reason to interface with client merchandising decisions at all. He had taken her to dinner twice, she said, ostensibly to discuss supply chain efficiencies that might benefit her stores, and during both conversations he had, with what she now recognized as deliberate subtlety, raised questions about our company's long-term leadership stability, mentioning my father's age, mentioning what he called some internal transitions happening at the executive level. Language vague enough that she had not thought much of it at the time, but specific enough in hindsight that she now understood exactly what he had been doing. He was laying groundwork, Patricia said, her voice carrying the particular disgust of a professional who has realized after the fact that she was being managed rather than simply engaged with. In case you two ever wanted to walk your business over to Blackwood, or wherever else he ends up landing. I think he wanted my account already primed to follow him. I asked her as gently as I could manage whether Elijah had ever suggested anything more direct, any indication that he expected to be in a position of greater authority within our company at some point in the near future. Patricia considered the question carefully before answering. The posture of someone choosing her words with the precision of a person who understood she might eventually be asked to repeat them under oath. He implied it more than once, she said. Never said it outright, but the impression I came away with both times we had dinner was that Elijah believed with total confidence that he was going to be running a significant piece of this company's client relationships within the next 2 years. Whether that happened here or somewhere else entirely. I thanked her, and I told her as honestly as I was able that whatever had been happening was already being addressed at the highest level the company had, and that her business and our relationship would not be affected by any of it. She nodded, satisfied, and as I stood to leave, she added one final thing that stayed with me the entire drive back to High Point. "For what it's worth," she said, "I never once doubted you, Logan. Whatever this turns out to be, I want you to know that." I drove home that evening with Patricia's confirmation added to the growing weight of everything else we had assembled. And I understood, pulling into my own driveway, as the porch light clicked on automatically in the deepening dark, that we had finally reached the point my father had been quietly steering us toward for weeks. We had enough. All that remained now was choosing exactly when and exactly how publicly to bring it forward. The decision about timing in the end was not really a decision at all. It was a date already sitting on the calendar, one that had been planned for over a year before any of this began. And once my father and Liam both recognized what it offered, neither of them saw any reason to look further. Edwards Furniture Manufacturing was turning 60 years old that November. 60 years since my grandfather walked into a bank with nothing but steady hands and a plan for a single wood lathe. And the company had been planning a formal anniversary celebration for months. A gathering at the plant itself, our senior staff, our board, major clients, including Patricia Ramirez and several others, longtime employees, and, at my father's specific request, made months before any of this unfolded. A modest press presence from regional trade publications to mark 6 decades of continuous family ownership in an industry where that kind of longevity had become genuinely rare. The event committee had transformed our largest production floor, cleared and scrubbed for the occasion, into something that barely resembled a working factory. At all round tables draped in white linen, arranged among the very machines that had built the company's reputation. A small stage erected near the loading dock, where my grandfather's original lathe, restored and gleaming, would sit on display, beside a timeline of the company's history, stretching across 3 60-year-old walls. Joe Taylor, a reporter who had covered the High Point furniture market for the better part of 2 decades for a respected regional trade publication, had already been invited to attend and write a feature piece on the company's history. An invitation extended in the ordinary course of business, well before I had any reason to suspect what that presence might eventually mean. My father was the one who first said it out loud, sitting at Liam's conference table 4 days before the event, surrounded by the accumulated weight of everything we had gathered: Bruce's financial trail, Mary's email archive, Patricia's statement, the specification trap that had started it all. "We are not creating a spectacle for its own sake," he said, his voice carrying the particular gravity I had come to associate with him only in the most serious moments of my life. "But I built this company on the principle that the truth presented clearly and without theater is the most powerful thing a man can offer a room full of people who trust him. 60 years of clients and employees are going to be standing in that building already. I would rather they hear this from us directly, in the open, than watch it unfold later through a courtroom filing, or a rumor that reaches them secondhand and incomplete." Liam had spent those 4 days finalizing everything that would need to happen simultaneously once the truth became public. Termination documentation for Elijah that would take effect the moment it was delivered. A formal notice to the board regarding Jennifer's position and the ownership implications of the shell company. Evidence, and working alongside the white-collar specialist he had brought in. A referral package prepared for federal prosecutors, covering wire fraud and corporate espionage, that could be filed within days of the event itself. I want to be honest that I did not sleep at all the night before. Not from fear exactly, but from the particular restlessness of a man standing at the very edge of the last ordinary day of his old life. Jennifer slept beside me, as she always did, unaware that Liam's associate had that same afternoon filed the preliminary paperwork that would freeze both shell company accounts the following morning, unaware that Bruce had spent the evening confirming Elijah's scheduled attendance at tomorrow's event through a source inside the plant's event coordination team, unaware that her own father-in-law had spent that same evening on the phone with Joe Taylor, not revealing anything specific, simply confirming in careful general terms that tomorrow's celebration would include some remarks of unusual significance to the company's history. I drove to my father's house at 6 the next morning, before dawn, the way I had that first morning weeks earlier when this entire investigation began. He was already dressed, standing at his kitchen window, with a cup of coffee he had not yet touched, watching the gray light slowly find the edges of his backyard. He turned when he heard me come in, and for a long moment, neither of us said anything at all. Then he set his coffee down, crossed the kitchen, and put both hands on my shoulders, the way he had not done since I was a much younger man, standing in this same kitchen after my mother's funeral, needing steadiness more than words. "Logan," he said tomorrow, "in that room, this needs to come from you. Not from me, not from Liam, not from anyone else who has helped us gather what we have. You are the one who built the trap that caught them. You are the one who has carried this for weeks without breaking. And when you stand up in front of everyone, your grandfather and I spent 60 years building trust with, it needs to be your voice they hear. Because it is your integrity, more than anyone else's, that Jennifer and Elijah tried to quietly destroy. Tomorrow, son, you will be the one to speak. I will simply be standing right beside you when you do." The production floor did not look like itself that evening, and I want to describe it exactly as I saw it walking in, because the contrast between what that room had become and what I knew was about to happen inside it has stayed with me every day since. String lights had been hung in careful rows across the exposed steel rafters, transforming a space usually filled with the smell of sawdust and the steady grinding hum of machinery into something closer to a cathedral. Warm, golden light falling across 200 round tables draped in white linen, each one anchored by a small arrangement of dried flowers and a printed card bearing a photograph from some year in the company's history. My grandfather's original lathe sat gleaming on a raised platform near the loading dock, restored to a shine it had not carried since 1968. Flanked by a timeline exhibit tracing 60 years of growth across 3 long walls, black and white photographs of my grandfather as a young man, giving way, decade by decade, to my father in his prime, to me at various younger ages, standing on this same floor, and finally, to a large, formal portrait of our current senior leadership team, Jennifer included, taken only 8 months earlier. I stood near the entrance for a moment, watching 240 guests fill the room, longtime employees I had known for decades, board members, clients who had traveled from 3 states to celebrate what this company represented. And I felt the particular vertigo of a man standing inside a room built entirely from trust, that was about to be within the hour, deliberately and irrevocably tested, in front of everyone who had ever extended it. Jennifer arrived at my side 20 minutes after I did, radiant in a deep emerald dress I had complimented without thinking out of 30 years of automatic habit before I fully registered what I had done. She moved through the room the way she moved through every room, effortlessly, warmly, stopping to embrace board members she had known for years, laughing at exactly the right moments, her hand occasionally finding my arm in the particular practiced gesture of a devoted wife, standing beside her husband on his family's proudest night. I let her do it. I want to be honest that some small, exhausted part of me still found comfort in the performance, even knowing with total certainty exactly what it was. I watched her greet Dennis Ashworth's replacement at the far end of the room, watched her lean in to admire someone's grandchild's photograph, watched her do 100 small, warm things that a genuinely good woman does at a gathering like this one. And I understood, standing there, with the weight of everything I knew pressing against my ribs, that grief for a marriage does not arrive all at once and then simply recede. It arrives in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes entirely without warning. And that particular wave, watching her be so effortlessly, convincingly herself in a room full of people who loved her, very nearly took my legs out from under me before the evening had even properly begun. Elijah arrived closer to the official start time, dressed in a charcoal suit that fit him with the precision of a man who understood exactly how good he looked in a room and had planned his entrance accordingly. He greeted colleagues with his easy, practiced warmth, shook hands with board members, and, at one point, crossing near the small stage where I stood reviewing my notes, he clapped me on the shoulder with a familiarity that, on any other night, I might have read as genuine collegial affection. "Big night, Logan," he said, his smile wide and entirely unguarded. 60 years. Your grandfather would be proud." I looked at him for a moment longer than the comment required, long enough that something briefly flickered behind his own easy expression. A half-second of uncertainty so small I might have imagined it, if I had not spent weeks by then learning to read exactly this kind of tell. "He would be," I said, and I let him walk away, believing the sentence meant only what it appeared to mean. My father found me near the stage as the room began settling into its seats, the caterers making final passes with wine, the low hum of 200 conversations gradually softening in anticipation of the evening's formal program. He did not say anything. He simply stood beside me the way he had promised he would, his hand resting briefly on my shoulder, in a gesture that carried the full weight of everything we had built toward this single evening. The MC, our board chairman, a longtime family friend, who had no idea what was about to unfold, stepped up to the small stage and began his opening remarks, thanking everyone for 60 years of partnership, previewing a short retrospective video before turning the program over to what the printed agenda described simply as remarks from the family. I felt Liam's eyes find mine from a table near the front, a small, deliberate nod, confirming that everything on his end, the paperwork, the frozen accounts, the prosecutors on standby, was in place and waiting. The chairman finished his introduction and gestured toward me, inviting me up to the small stage to formally open the evening's program. And I felt Jennifer's hand tighten briefly around my arm, an encouraging squeeze, the last one she would ever give me. Believing it meant what it had always meant before, I walked to the stage. I picked up the microphone, and as the room settled into an expectant hush, I found Jennifer's eyes across 200 tables of people who trusted this family completely. And I held her gaze for exactly as long as it took her to understand, with the particular clarity that comes only in the final second before something irreversible begins, that tonight was not going to unfold the way she had always assumed it would. "Good evening." I began, my voice steadier than I expected it to be, carrying clean across a room that had gone almost completely silent in anticipation of what everyone assumed would be a simple sentimental toast to 60 years of family business. 60 years ago, my grandfather walked into a bank in this town, with nothing but a plan and 2 steady hands, and asked for a loan against a piece of equipment he did not yet own. Everything in this room tonight, every job, every client relationship, every dollar this company has ever paid to a family that depended on it, exists because a banker decided to trust a stranger's steady hands over a business plan that, on paper, made very little sense. I paused there, letting the room settle further into the particular hush that comes when 200 people sense, without yet knowing why, that something larger than expected is unfolding in front of them. Trust, I continued, is the only material this company has ever actually been built from. Wood, steel, upholstery, These are simply the things trust allows us to shape into something people are willing to pay for. And tonight, before I say anything else about our history, I need to tell all of you something that has been happening inside the foundation of that trust for the better part of a year. Because I believe every person in this room deserves to hear it directly from me, rather than discover it later through a courtroom filing or a headline none of us controlled. I saw Jennifer's posture change from the stage. A subtle stiffening I doubt anyone without 30 years of marriage to her would have caught. Elijah, 2 tables away, had gone very still. Over the past year, I said Edwards Furniture Manufacturing lost 3 of its largest client accounts under circumstances that at the time appeared to be simple market competition. They were not. I have spent the last several weeks alongside my father, our family attorney, and a licensed investigator documenting exactly how and why those accounts were lost. And what that documentation reveals is a coordinated scheme of corporate espionage, financial fraud, and personal betrayal that I could not have imagined possible inside these walls. I named Elijah first because the corporate fraud was the piece I could describe with the least personal difficulty. I described in careful, measured language. Liam had helped me prepare the specification access log, the pricing error that nearly cost us millions. Alan's documented shipping delays. Mary's recovered emails referencing finder's fees. Bruce's financial trace connecting 2 shell companies to over $400,000 in payments from a direct competitor. The room had gone completely silent by then. 240 people staring at a man they had known for years, who had only minutes earlier been greeting them with wine in hand. And I want to be honest with all of you. I continued that Elijah Diaz did not do this alone. He had a partner inside this company, someone with legitimate access to our most sensitive information, someone whose name appears directly on the registration paperwork for one of the 2 shell companies that received stolen payments. I felt the entire room turn as one body toward Jennifer, whose face, when I finally looked at her directly, had gone the particular color of a person watching the floor disappear beneath her. "My wife," I said, and my voice for the first time all evening cracked slightly on the word, "has spent the past several months working alongside Mr. Diaz to divert client relationships to a direct competitor, to defraud this company of confidential trade information, and based on email correspondence we have recovered, to position herself for eventual control of a company that my grandfather, my father, and I have spent 60 years building." Jennifer stood abruptly, her chair scraping loud against the concrete floor, her voice rising with a sharpness I had rarely heard from her in public. "This is insane, Logan. You cannot possibly—" That was the moment the side doors opened. 2 men in plain dark suits entered the room with the unhurried, deliberate walk of people who had done this exact thing many times before. And I watched recognition move through the crowd as several longtime board members who had dealt with federal regulators before in other contexts understood immediately what they were looking at even before introductions were made. The taller of the 2 men approached the stage directly, holding up identification that caught the light briefly as he addressed the room in a calm, carrying voice. "My name is Special Agent Juan King," he said, "with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the interruption to your evening. Based on evidence provided to our office earlier this week by counsel for Edwards Furniture Manufacturing, we have an active warrant regarding wire fraud and corporate espionage, connected to 2 individuals believed to be present at this event tonight." The room had gone past silence into something closer to total suspended stillness. 240 people watching a scene unfold that none of them could have imagined walking in an hour earlier. Agent King turned first toward Elijah, who had risen from his chair with the particular stiffness of a man calculating too late whether the nearest exit was still a realistic option. "Mr. Diaz," the agent said, "I need you to come with us." Elijah did not run. I want to note that, because some part of me had almost expected him to. He simply stood there for a long moment, his composure finally completely gone, before he allowed the second agent to approach and begin the formal process of his detention. The room watching in a silence so complete, I could hear from the stage the small mechanical click of handcuffs closing. Then Agent King turned toward Jennifer, still standing at our table, with her hand pressed flat against the white linen as though she needed it to remain upright. And he said in the same calm, unhurried voice he had used for Elijah, the sentence that ended in front of everyone she had ever wanted to impress. 30 years of a life she had built on a foundation none of them, until tonight, had ever thought to question. Mrs. Edwards, I need you to come with us as well. Nobody moved for what felt like a very long time, though Liam told me afterward it could not have been more than 10 or 15 seconds. The particular kind of silence that stretches time out of its normal shape. Jennifer did not fight the agents. I want to tell you that clearly, because some part of me had braced for a scene, for shouting, for some final desperate performance aimed at the room full of people who had just watched 30 years of her carefully constructed life come apart in front of them. She simply stood very still, while the second agent explained her rights in the flat, procedural cadence officers use for exactly this purpose. Her eyes moving once briefly toward me, carrying an expression I still cannot fully name. Not quite apology, not quite anger. Something closer to a woman finally understanding that a game she believed herself to be winning had in fact already ended weeks earlier, without her ever knowing it. She did not look toward Billy. I noticed that distinctly in the strange, hyper-focused clarity that comes over a person during moments like this one. And I understood even then that it would matter to him later the specific absence of that final glance. Billy was seated 3 tables back, and I watched him rise slowly to his feet as the agents began walking his mother toward the side exit. His face gone completely white, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though he needed something solid to keep himself upright. He did not call out. He did not move toward her. He simply stood there, 20 years old, watching his mother be led out of the building where 3 generations of his family had built something he had spent his entire childhood being proud of. And I crossed the room to him as quickly as I could manage without breaking into a run. Because whatever else had happened that night, whatever I had needed to do to protect this company and this family's future, my son needed his father standing beside him in that exact moment more than anything else in the world. I reached him just as the side doors closed behind Agent King and his colleagues, and Billy turned to me with an expression that broke something in my chest that had until that second remained intact through everything else that evening had asked of me. "Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is it all true? All of it?" I put both hands on his shoulders, the way my father had done for me in his kitchen weeks earlier, and I told him the truth, because he deserved nothing less after watching what he had just watched. "Yes," I said, "all of it. I am so sorry you had to learn it this way." He nodded slowly, his jaw working the way mine does when I am holding something back by force of will alone. And then he stepped forward and put his arms around me. And I held my son in the middle of a production floor filled with 240 stunned guests. String lights glowing warm and golden overhead. My grandfather's restored lathe gleaming on its platform a few feet away. And I understood that whatever came next, whatever the coming months of legal proceedings and divorce filings and rebuilding would require of both of us, we were at least going to face it together. My father reached us a moment later, placing one hand on Billy's back and the other on my shoulder. The 3 generations of Edwards men standing together in the wreckage and relief of a night that had asked more of this family than perhaps any single evening in 60 years of its history. Joe Taylor approached cautiously from the edge of the crowd sometime later, notebook in hand, and asked with more genuine gentleness than I expected from a reporter, working what was obviously the story of his career, whether I wanted to say anything for the record. I told him only this, and he printed it exactly as I said it in the piece that ran 3 days later. Tonight was hard. But this company has survived 60 years by never once building anything on a foundation we were not willing to inspect honestly, even when honesty costs us something we love. That is not going to change now. The party did not continue after that, though. Nobody quite knew how to formally end it either. Guests drifted toward the exits in small, quiet clusters over the following hour. Many stopping first to find me, to press my hand, to tell me some version of the same sentiment Patricia Ramirez had offered weeks earlier in her Wilmington office. Nobody doubted you, Logan. Whatever this turns out to be, we are still standing with you. I stayed on that production floor until nearly midnight, helping the event staff begin clearing tables, alongside Alan Robinson, who had shown up without being asked, the moment word reached him, still in the same understated way he had carried himself through every part of this entire ordeal. My father sat at one of the last remaining tables, watching us work, Billy beside him, and at some point gathering folded linens. In my arms, I looked up at that room, at the restored lathe, at the timeline of 60 years stretching across those 3 long walls, and I understood that whatever this company had lost that night, it had also, in the truest sense, finally been protected. Jennifer and Elijah were both indicted 11 weeks later on federal charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, along with state charges of financial exploitation and breach of fiduciary duty. Elijah pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence and cooperation against Blackwood's executive team, and received 4 years in federal prison. Jennifer, after a trial that lasted 8 days and drew coverage from business publications across 3 states, was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 6 years. The additional weight reflecting her fiduciary position within the company, and the discovery during trial of a second attempt to access company funds that Bruce had uncovered only after her arrest. Our divorce was finalized quietly months later, once the criminal proceedings concluded. Billy chose entirely on his own to have no contact with his mother during her sentence, a decision I never asked him to make, and one I have never once tried to talk him out of. Though I have told him more than once that the door remains his to open again someday if he ever wants to. He graduated with his engineering degree the following spring and came to work at Edwards Furniture Manufacturing that same year, standing now where I once stood, learning the business the way his grandfather once taught me. Wood grain and load-bearing joints and the particular patience required to build something meant to outlast you. If this story taught me anything, it is that trust and vigilance are not opposites. For 30 years, I believed that loving someone completely meant never questioning them, that suspicion itself was a kind of betrayal. I understand now that the people who truly deserve your trust are never diminished by your attention. It is only the ones already planning to take something from you who need your blindness to succeed. Pay attention to the small things. Write down the dates. Keep the documents, not because you expect the worst from the people you love, but because love without clear eyes is not actually protection. It is simply hope standing unguarded in a room where someone else has already decided what they intend to take. I think often of my father's hands on my shoulders in that kitchen, the steadiness in them, despite 89 years of wear. And I think of my grandfather's hands on a bank officer's desk 60 years before that, asking for a chance nobody was obligated to give him. 3 generations of hands, building something worth protecting. And I understand now that protecting it was never going to be a single act. It was always going to be a practice, repeated generation after generation, for as long as the company and the family behind it continued to exist at all. If you have ever felt that particular cold instinct that something in your own life does not quite add up, I hope you trust it the way I eventually learned to trust mine. And if this story reached you, share it with someone who needs to hear that patience, documentation, and the people who show up quietly beside you are often stronger than anger ever could be. Thank you for staying with me until the end.